Crazy. Good evening, and welcome to Couch Conversations with the Doctors, where health is wealth. What night is it tonight? It is Monday night, and it is time for Couch Conversations with the Doctors. As always, we're going to go around this great esteemed panel and do our introductions of all of our great physicians that are here with us tonight. To the doctor who hates to have accolades, but he is really the urologist of the stars. That's our very own Dr. Terry Mason. Dr. Mason.
Thank you, Nikki. And again, I appreciate you and the congressman for creating this platform and maintaining this platform and creating the audience that listens to this. And I'm grateful to be a part of it. And I am always honored to be with my esteemed colleagues for these kinds of conversations.
Outstanding, outstanding. Thank you so much, Dr. Mason. To the man who was really an art connoisseur, but he's our very own Joe Harrington. Joe.
Thank you, Nikki, and I want to thank you and the Congressman for providing this platform. I'm honored to be here. I think I've been introducing myself every time I've been on the program, so I'll try to be very brief. My career has been mostly in public health and healthcare. I retired in 2017 from the Illinois Department of Public Health, where I was the regional health officer for Cook County and an administrative law judge. And like my esteemed colleagues, I am a servant leader.
Outstanding. Want to say hey to Lieutenant Daniel Allen, who's here with us. We often funny call him Lieutenant Dan. Want to say hey to Sister Bonnie, who is here with us just as well. Hey, Sister Bonnie, how are you? Want to say hi to Carrie Steele, who's texting in saying that she's here, and hey to Audrey J. Cox, who's here. To the doctor who's known on the streets as being Dr. 100. That's our very own Dr. Maya Green. Dr. 100.
Hello, Nikki. Thank you to you and the Congressman for creating this space. Thanks to my colleagues here. It's always a pleasure. I see we have our guest, Dr. Pittman. Last time we had an exciting call. I love the things I was learning, and I'm looking to learn more, get into more of the conversation that Dr. Mason was schooling me on 100 today.
All right, Dr. 100. Thank you so much. To the doctor who's a DJ in the evening and a physician by day. That's our very own Dr. Bonnie Pete Thomas. Hey, Dr. Pete, how are you?
Hey, Nikki. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for you and the Congressman creating this forum for us to educate our community. I'm excited to see my brother Isaiah here. We go way back when we was trying to get into med school. It's great to see everyone. And I'm looking forward to a great, vibrant conversation.
All right. Well, we have one that's a DJ by night and a physician during the day. We also have one that's a musician at night and a DJ and a physician during the day. That's our very own Dr. Pittman. Dr. Pittman.
How you guys doing? And thanks for having me back on the show. Pete, it is great to see you. I have to tell Lino that we're on the show together. But again, thank you guys for having me, and I'm sure we'll have a stimulating conversation here.
Well, there's a special message for Dr. Pete and Joe Harrington, and the message just says 06. So I just thought I would share that. I got a text that says 06. All right, to the man who says I threaten him every Monday night to be here, but he seems to always be on time. That's our very own Dr. James Miller. Dr. Miller?
Well, good evening, and you see, I know how to respond to threats. I want to thank for having me on this panel. I'm a retired internist. I retired from clinical practice in 2019, but I'm still learning, and I'm still interested in healing our community. So I'm here to do what I can to provide whatever information that may be useful, as well as to learn. So let's get it on.
All right, and thank you so very much. Want to say hey to our very own Mr. Edwin Callahan, who's viewing us on this evening. Hey, Mr. Callahan, how are you? To Kim Godden, the Vice President of Superior Ambulance, who is always hanging out with us. Just as well, want to say hey to you. To my colleague and co-worker, who leaves me periodically and goes and have fun in the sun, but I think some kind of way he found his way back to Chicago, and that's our very own Dr. Douglas Graham. Dr. Graham?
Nikki, you're right. It's fall in Chicago. It's beautiful here. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I'm a retired rheumatologist. I spent 30 years working in the western suburbs and 2 years with a congressman in Washington, D.C. And I'll tell you, it's a privilege and honor to be here, and I'll try and answer your questions if I can.
Outstanding. Want to say hey to Paula Yates from Loretta Hospital, who has checked in with us. Hey to Rose Parker, who is also here. To Trina Johnson from Urban Transformation, who is here just as well. To Virginia Knight, who says, evening, everyone. Awesome day to be alive. And want to say hey to Kay Rita. Hey, officer, how are you? She says hello to everyone. Well, Dr. Mason, as we always do, we have these vibrant conversations right as we're beginning to start. Why don't you guys go ahead while I fix some technical difficulties back here?
Well, you know, I think that we had a great and very stimulating conversation about diabetes that was led a couple of weeks ago, and I want to continue that conversation. And I'd like to start by, I think it's Dr. Pittman, right?
Yes.
Because a lot of people think diabetes has something to do with just eating sugar. And that's why they call it sugar diabetes, because it's eating sugar. So why don't we level the playing field, Dr. Pittman, if you will, and just let us just what is diabetes and what are the things, and we'll get to that as we get to the second part of the question, are what are those triggers or pre-triggers for diabetes?
And I hear that quite a bit, and I jokingly tell my patients it's not like the Hansel and Gretel story. So you don't become diabetic because you ate a lot of sugar. That's not it. And another thing that people believe is that their blood sugar elevates significantly, either because they ate something sweet when they're in clinic, because we do random glucose checks in clinic. And they'll think their blood sugar, especially if they came for a thyroid disorder or some other reason, when we randomly check and their glucose is high, they say, oh, well, I just ate in the car. And so, and I remind them, no, it's because you're diabetic. You just didn't know it. So we hear that all the time. Now, what is diabetes? As a recap, for those who weren't on our last show, the actual pathophysiologic definition of diabetes, which does not coincide with the clinical definition, right? Because the clinical definition of diabetes changes probably every, let's say, 15 to 20 years. But the pathophysiologic definition of diabetes.
Now, what do you mean when you say that? Because, we're not all doctors here. So
I understand. So I'm going to say, when we talk about
pathophysiologic,
meaning what is the actual disease state definition? Meaning what is diabetes to everyone versus to just these group of doctors or those group of doctors, or people who lived in the 1900s versus people who are trained in 2000 and so on and so forth. So, and by clinical definition, I mean that we will call a disease state something based upon how easy it is to treat, how affordable it is to treat, and oftentimes what political or insurance bodies happen to be around. And the same thing is the case with high blood pressure. We'll change those criteria based upon who and how we want to treat clinically, but that doesn't change the actual disease state definition. And so the disease state definition for diabetes is it is a syndrome of disorders, meaning a bunch of things that go wrong, of which a common manifestation, a common link is abnormal glucose, abnormal sugar metabolism, right? So when you have a bunch of things going on, and the common link between them is that the blood sugar, or the sugar in the blood, is abnormally metabolized, that is diabetes, right? That is a definition of diabetes.
Now go back. I want you, Doc, I want you to go back again, and I'm gonna do it all the time. So just get used to it, because this is what I do. And we want to make sure we all understand what you're saying, but they don't know what you're talking about. So when you say it metabolized, what do you mean? What does that mean?
How you process the sugar. So metabolize means how do you process the sugar? Meaning, are you able to properly use glucose or sugar that's in your bloodstream? So say, for instance, as many people think, that if you eat something sweet, your blood sugar goes up. And then if it comes back down, they feel, well, that's perfectly normal. And I tell people every day, no, that's not normal, because in reality, when you eat something sweet, when you properly dispose of or get rid of that sugar and it goes in the cells properly, the blood sugar never goes up by very much to begin with, right? So a kid that eats birthday cake and that's perfectly healthy, their blood sugar doesn't go up, and it simply comes back down because they actually properly metabolize or properly use the sugar. It never goes up in the first place because all of the mechanisms in your body is designed not to bring the blood sugar down. Your body is designed to prevent the blood sugar from going up in the first place. So when it actually goes up, that is one of the first clinical, meaning signs that we can measure on an easy basis that diabetes is ensuing or potentially on its way or potentially even there. But just that's why we say a syndrome, because there's more than one factor that comes into play when it comes to diabetes. And this is why, I think that people really should be seen by someone who specializes in diabetes. And it's also why I left the university and decided to form my own diabetes centers, even though I was primary research faculty and had no problem with funding, with nearly $3 million total in funding when I was at the University of Chicago. The reality of the matter is that there was not a lot of community outreach, not a lot of these things that we are doing right now in terms of diabetes. And I thought that that was very, very necessary, with it being of such epidemic proportion. We needed to have these conversations. I needed to have them with colleagues and for us to have forum like this for patients to listen to and better understand the disease, so that there won't be so much anxiety and there won't be so much fear and confusion, given we can treat diabetes so very effectively and pretty much eliminate and reduce the complications of diabetes oftentimes.
I don't want to hog this thing, but I do want to make sure that we make some points for the listeners. So what do you do, or what are we doing about the disease, even though we move the number, but what are we doing about the disease with our so-called diabetes management and control?
And so I don't know if anybody else wants to answer before me, before I just jump right in. And if not, I will simply say that the management strategies for diabetes have changed drastically over the decades. So, and then the recognition of diabetes not just being about the glucoses has changed drastically, and I love it. As an endocrinologist who did research in diabetes, all of us are not specific diabetes folks who did research in diabetes, and I tell patients that there are thyroid guys, there's people who deal with the thyroid largely, but they treat everything. People who deal with the adrenal largely, but treat everything. Pituitary. So I happen to be one of the guys who did diabetes, and for me, it's a great time. Because for one, everyone realizes, most of us in medicine at this point acknowledge, that diabetes is not just fix the glucoses. They realize that it is a major, if not the major contributor to heart disease, the major contributor to kidney disease, the major contributor to blindness and amputations, and that treating the disorder prevents these complications, and using certain therapies actually can prevent and reduce these complications, even independent of controlling the blood sugars, because we have gone to a more scientific way of treating diabetes versus just chasing a number, actually understanding that word that I mentioned before, the pathophysiology of the disorder, the actual way the disease works, has allowed us to use therapies now that can reduce heart disease, reduce kidney disease, even when the blood sugars are well controlled, and just using certain mechanisms, certain ways to address the rest of that syndrome outside of just the glucose, because it's so much more than just the glucose. And so things have changed a lot. And, you know, we wouldn't be able to cover it on the show, but just to say that the science has changed a ton in terms of from a clinical standpoint. You know, I can remember, you know, 30 years ago hearing, you know, actually, I guess maybe more than 30 years ago, I'm dating myself, but let's say roughly 30 years ago, learning about meds and a guy, Graham Bell at University of Chicago, cloned a gene for a molecule known as GLP-1 back in 86, which back then it was a, you know, interesting finding. And I remember getting a text from, you know, one of my thesis advisors, a book about that thick, still a hard copy, called Gut Hormones. And, you know, and now we call them incretin hormones, which we did then too. But those hormones are part of normal therapy now. And they are probably the most relevant cardiovascular meds, or one of the most relevant cardiovascular meds that are used. In fact, medicines that are used to treat diabetes today prevent heart disease more than anything that happens on an outpatient basis in a cardiology clinic, right? There's pretty much nothing that happens in a cardiology clinic that actually has better outcomes data, meaning better data to reduce or prevent heart disease than the medicines that we use that were designed for the syndrome of diabetes, given that heart disease is part of that syndrome.
Yeah, well, I want my other colleagues to jump in too, but I want to, before I do that, I just want to leave you with my most powerful 2-word question I could ever come up with. And it's called, so what? You know, so what? I mean, you do these things, you say it's not about the blood sugar control, not about the number. So what is it about? And how do you and the other colleagues please all share in? Because this is not what I do. I just dealt with the guys who were impotent as a result of it.
Now here I am gonna answer first, because I absolutely thank you for making that statement, because that is exactly how I was taught. So what about the glucose? We treat diabetes so that people live longer, because everyone used to die, right? So I'm glad you brought that up, because if you don't manage, the reason we treat diabetes is not to get the A1C down, because the A1C didn't exist until 1980s in clinical medicine, right? It existed in research, but we didn't use it until the 1980s in clinical medicine, right? And, you know, so what about what the glucose number is? You couldn't readily measure your glucoses at home until the early 80s, late 70s. We didn't have glucometers back in the 60s. You're right. So what? Why were we still treating diabetes back then? Because back then, people, before we had all these fancy machines and ways of doing all the things, we actually didn't train our residents to focus so much on the numbers. Our residents 50, 60 years ago understood. Our patients 50, 60 years ago understood. The reason you're treating diabetes is because you die if you don't. Plain and simple. I love having my 90-year-old patients, my 80-year-old patients that they check their glucoses 4 times a day. And you guys know what I'm talking about. Those 90-year-olds and 80-year-olds are way more compliant than the 30-year-olds and 20-year-olds. You know why? Because they know that you die if you don't do it, right? They understand that you die if you don't manage diabetes. Right now, our younger patients think that if you don't do this, your numbers are high. Right? They don't associate their diabetes with death. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because literally before insulin was isolated and made readily available in 1923, 100% of type 1 diabetics died within an 18-month period. Between 6 to 18 months, they were dead. And that was the case all the way back to ancient Egypt. So we would not have a Halle Berry right now if it were not for insulin being made available. We would not have a Nick Jonas, right? So this is because they would have died within a 6 to 18 month period, right? So in type 2 diabetics, the people that are insulin resistant, and very common, the majority of diabetics, we actually today look at them as like, oh, well, you know, it's not a bad case. What we don't realize is that they were dead within 6 to 8 years before insulin was licensed. It was a death sentence, right? So this is why in so many cultures, people are so afraid of the diagnosis, because they still remember what happened when you were diagnosed with diabetes. You were going to have your leg lopped, your foot lopped off, your leg lopped off, and you were going to be dead. And so I'm glad you brought that up. It is not about the numbers, which is why we use so many therapies that keep people alive, not just get the numbers down.
Again, I
Well,
want
that is simply. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Mason. Come on.
No, I just want to get the other, because we have internists and other people on the panel, and and to what you're saying, what are your guys, what the other guys, what do you guys, how do you feel about what you just heard, and how does this impact the way you treat the patients that you see on a daily basis?
Well, I'm going to go from a public health perspective, because that's where I spent a lot of my time. I worked at 3 hospitals, but I spent most of my career in public health. And one of our focuses is primary prevention and preventing disease. And so a point that I want to make is, like diabetes, heart disease, stroke, obesity, lung cancer are diseases of lifestyle. They're due to a lack of physical activity, unhealthy eating, alcohol, substance use disorders, and smoking. And that's what's really driving a lot of what we see now. And so there are ways to prevent that. But once you have one of these diseases, management is the only option you have. If you want to live, and I'm just picking up on what Dr. Pittman said, management is the only option you have if you want to lead a long life. I'm just saying a long life, not even a healthy life, but a long life. You need to be able to manage the disease. It also reminded me of this last conversation where there was this debate about of whether you can cure a disease. And we talked about, again, the importance of management. So I'm really thinking about this idea of management and how we manage disease. But I also want people to speak to things that you can do to prevent this from occurring in the first place. Because we can reduce the number of people that have diabetes, whose high blood pressure is high, who are having heart attacks, if we can get them to do some simple things, which I already mentioned.
So, right, and this is such a great, robust conversation. Just want to grab some of our community residents on the side. Tarina Newkirk Sutton is here, and she says, hello to everyone. Good to see you all. Judge Marianne Jackson is here, and she says, good evening to everyone. Pastor Crystal Kiles is here, and she says, good evening to everyone. Nellie Purnell King is here. She's saying, good evening. Connie Taylor is here just as well, and she's saying, good evening. Barbara Ivory says she is watching. Barbara Ivy also says, my physician was very upset with my A1C3 number of 11. Today it's 7.8. We were both pleased. Linda Johnson is here, and she's saying good evening to everyone just as well. Well, Pete and Dr. Miller, you both look like you got something to say, and I don't know who wants to go first, so take it away.
Yeah, well, my question is this: is that the big thing that we're hearing now is about the incidence of diabetes in our community, and so the question is this just related to the fact that we're doing a better job diagnosing this problem, or is it, or what's driving that number?
I'm glad that came up too, especially because as Dr. Harrington mentioned, in terms of from a public health standpoint, a lot of times we think that things have actually gotten worse than they really have gotten. Say, for instance, when we look back, folks will say, well, we didn't have as much diabetes, 25 years ago. Well, guess what? The diagnostic criteria were not as stringent 25 years ago, right? So 25 years ago, if you had a glucose, if you had a glucose fasting of 135 or 130, no one called you diabetic. Not even in general clinical medicine. Now, if you happen to have been on wards with one of the guys that were, major researchers, they'd have called you diabetic. But in general, you would not have been called diabetic. But then just within, 5 years after that, you were now diabetic because the diagnostic criteria changed. And if you go back 50 years, you would not have been called diabetic then. So a lot of the times we think that things have worsened when in fact, what Dr. Miller mentioned is absolutely the case. The understanding of the disease state within populations that are not that small percentage of people who do research within an area has changed significantly. Therefore, not only have the guidelines changed, the public health recognition of outcomes has changed. And so one of the major things that happened is even though Dr. Jocelyn, a famous endocrinologist, said back in the 40s, we've come to know this is a disease of the vasculature, the majority of medicine did not hear that statement nor care or think that it was relevant. It wasn't until literally after we entered the 21st century that the majority of medicine, including cardiologists, actually looked at diabetes as a major contributor to cardiovascular disease. Even though we had data dating back to the 1920s that clearly indicated that treating diabetes had an impact on cardiovascular outcomes, guess what we didn't have in the 1920s to go along with that data? We didn't have cardiology. Cardiology was not a specialty until the 1930s and didn't become established in the United States until the 1950s. So even though within endocrine, we noticed the cardiovascular advantage of treating diabetes, this was not recognized in general medicine, even in cardiovascular medicine, until literally nearly 50 years later, or over 50 years later almost. So what you said is absolutely correct. There is a recognition of, first of all, diagnosing, a recognition of the seriousness of the implications, and all of that contributes to awareness, which increases diagnosis as these diagnostic criteria increase. But now, has it absolutely increased because of what Dr. Harrington mentioned in terms of lifestyle? Absolutely. We know that too, but we have to say that all of those things have contributed, not just, people are just so much fatter that, because we know genetics plays a role as well. And so, yes, people are heavier and they're exercising less, but that's not all of it. We also are diagnosing a lot more people.
I just want to throw this out for the group too. Are we really talking about different diseases, or is so-called heart disease, so-called vascular disease, so-called kidney function, is there some link to all of that and the so-called what we call diabetes? And that's everybody, anybody and everybody can answer that.
Yes. I'll answer very simply there. Yes.
Yeah, my statement was they're diseases of lifestyle.
But
So there's
what
a
I'm trying to
connection.
say is the blood vessel, the damage to the blood vessel, is that caused by something different than what's causing the damage to the kidney? Is that causing something different than the disease that's causing damage to the eyes? Why is this disease doing this? What's common about all of those things, if there is such a thing, that makes that happen?
Well, Doug is unmuted. Doug, go ahead. You got something to say?
Well, I want to wait for Dr. Pittman.
Okay.
But what I'm going to say is my diseases, especially rheumatoid arthritis, is very, very similar to this. That we have an abnormality of your body's defense system. You have more inflammation than you should. And this inflammation causes damage to the joints. It can also damage the skin, the nerves, the lungs. It can lead to hardening of the blood vessels. And surprisingly, it's also been related to cancer as well. When I started practice in 1985, you had a 60% chance of being disabled in 5 years if you had a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. And like Dr. Pittman, we learned to manage this disease so that people are not disabled, so they don't have damages to their heart, they don't have damage to their lungs, damage to their nerves. So it's a very, very similar situation. But the common element is you've got more of this chemical reaction called inflammation, and it's not healthy for you. It causes damage everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to actually go ahead and relay off of Dr. Graham and say, and stick with rheumatology, because it is also a very interesting and scientifically based field And many people in the audience will recognize the next disorder I'm going to mention even more than rheumatoid arthritis, especially the African American population, and that is lupus.
Yeah.
When one of the things we used to say in training was to know lupus is to know medicine.
Yeah.
Because it did so much. If you fully understood what could happen with lupus, it used to literally be a joking, not a joke, but sort of a statement that was made on the wards. To know lupus is to know medicine. You pretty much cover everything. And with diabetes, it is very similar, right? In the endocrine world, you could pretty much say to know diabetes is to know medicine because it is affecting that many organ systems. But what Dr. Graham has said is a key factor. We're not talking about this organ or that organ. We're really talking about being on a molecular level, the level of inflammation, the level of changes that are occurring on a molecular level and cellular level that goes throughout the entire body, so that we can't just focus on this organ system or that organ system, but it becomes much more cellular and molecular, which is why it ends up everywhere.
Well,
what is inflammation? Somebody tell me, what is inflammation? What does that mean?
Dr. Basin,
Dr. Graham?
It's a chemical reaction. It's a chemical reaction.
Now remember now, Doctor, you're talking to Joe Q bus driver.
Okay. Well, for instance, if you pour a Coke into a glass, you get a lot of foam coming up, and that foam is coming up because bubbles are being released. You think of inflammation kind of like that reaction, but instead of just getting these harmless bubbles, you're getting chemicals that can cause damage, like acids or bases. And so those chemicals, which are part of the process of, it's an abnormal chemical reaction. You're producing more chemicals than you should, of the kind that could hurt you rather than help you.
So how does that end up, again, anybody, Pete, anybody. So how does that end up causing, why do I end up losing my leg? Why do my kidneys go bad? Why do I have to, why do I have to end up with the sequential amputations? Why do I have to do, what is that? Why does that all happen with this? How does this, what you guys described, how does that do that?
Well, I'll just say, first, what happens is that inflammation causes damage to the inner lining of the blood vessels, and then as a result of that, your body tries to repair that damage, and then as a result of that blood vessel eventually becomes occluded or blocked, and now you don't have adequate blood supply going to that organ or that cell or whatever, and so it's stopping. Like, it's like I always tell my patients, it's like what causes, like if I were to hit your toe with a hammer, what happens to your toe, right? It swells, turns red, it turns a different color, it starts to hurt, that's the rubor, color, all of the signs of inflammation. But the key is that once your body's trying to repair it, it's blocking it eventually, the repair. Your body was trying to help, but as a result of trying to help, that blood supply is cut off or reduced.
And our patients recognize this. Our patients, the example that Pete just gave is a wonderful example, because it's one that our patients will recognize, because it hurt when you hit that toe. It hurt like heck. But they notice that as that inflammation kicks in, they can't even feel that toe, because that inflammation cuts off the blood circulation, it damages the nerves, and now that toe that was previously hurting like heck now gets numb and tingly, and you can barely even tell that you hit it because you're looking at it and it's big and blistered looking, but it doesn't hurt nearly like it did before because of that swelling and inflammation. And I remember back in the day, I used to be annoyed with when it comes to the heart. And I think a lot of you guys would agree, but it would annoy us, especially from a physiologic standpoint, when patients would be told that the heart is like a pump and the vessels are like pipes, right? And, you know, this pump has to pump, you know, the blood through these pipes, and one of these pipes is blocked. And, you know, from a physiologic standpoint, you know, we say, no, that you can't tell patients that their vessels are like a pipe, because a pipe is not responsive. You scrape a pipe and nothing happens other than you clean it off. Your blood vessels are living cells. You scrape them and they respond in the way that we just mentioned. They get inflamed, and we have an even bigger problem than we had potentially than at first. And the same thing with the heart. And so inflammation is a huge, what we call the inflammatory response is a huge part of many disease states that we have to remember in terms of why so many bad things happen.
Yeah. I'll just say one other thing that probably, you know, those in the general public may understand is that one of the end results of this inflammation is scarring. So that you get damage and then you get scarring. And obviously when things scar, they get smaller, they get compromised. And so it's the scarring, that end results that lead to the vessels being damaged and no longer able to function and allow the flow that need to occur to occur.
Right.
Well, this is such an outstanding conversation. Lolita Travis says, good evening, panel. Valdemir Talley, that's Chief Talley, says, I like the response to the inflammation. And then I'm going to throw a few questions at you guys that we have from our community. Our first question is from Miss Reed. Miss Reed says, what about sarcoidosis and diabetes? I have both diagnoses. Also, Janice Henry asks, will taking fish oil reduce my inflammation? And the third question I'm going to throw out there to you, and you guys just grab them and do as you like with them, is inflammation a problem with all diseases that we have? And can inflammation be caused by many diseases? Hey, Laura Leon, I see that you're here with us just as well. You guys take it away. Don't everybody answer
You're
at one
muted.
time.
I saw Dr. Graham is speaking, but he was muted.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll take a swing at sarcoidosis and diabetes, which is a really, really challenging set of circumstances because the primary treatment for sarcoidosis would be steroids, and steroids is something that will make the diabetes worse. So that's a very, very challenging set of circumstances. Now, fortunately, there are alternative treatments. It may be hard to know whether or not the treatment for the sarcoidosis in some way triggered or provoked the diabetes. I can't, I'm not sure about that, but that's a possibility. I just know that it's a very complex management problem, but still solvable. Dr. Pittman?
Yeah, you absolutely have to have a team
Yeah.
approach from that standpoint. I mean, you know, I actually like working with rheumatology as well as cardiology and nephrology because it gets complex and interesting because of that. So there has to be a team approach from that perspective when someone has both of those disease states, and that's pretty much the easy. But yes, the inflammation plays a role in both of the disease states, and in particular, again, from a cardiovascular outcome standpoint, we have to be very aggressive in with managing both of them, because as he's already mentioned, rheumatoid disease and lupus. Now we're talking sarcoid, and when you combine all of those, any one of those with diabetes, you have yourself, you know, a picture in which it has to be taken quite seriously. And from a preventive medicine standpoint, we take it quite seriously.
How does this all come together in things like kidney disease and eye disease? Are the, you know, everybody thinks these are all different, but are they really?
Well, they're pretty similar, which is why we look at them as macrovascular and then microvascular, meaning larger vessels and smaller vessels. But at the end of the day, what Pete mentioned, what Dr. Graham mentioned, what Dr. Miller, Dr. Harrington, Dr. Meyer agrees, it's all blood vessels that are being damaged by this inflammatory process that goes through the entire body. And so that's the issue. This is why, as Dr. Graham mentioned, people may think of rheumatoid arthritis affecting just their hands or a joint, but what they don't realize is that inflammation, that response, as he gave an example of the carbon dioxide released from a soda at the top of the gas. Use that exact same example. That carbon dioxide is not just at the top of that glass when you pour that soda. That carbon dioxide just went into the whole room, right? Molecules of carbon dioxide just released into the entire room when you pour your glass of Coke or you pour your glass of soda. It didn't just stay at the top of that glass. And the same thing, when that reaction starts in one part of your body, it's going through your entire body. Because there's nothing to stop it, and it can cause potential problems at other places that are very distant from the fingers that may be inflamed, or the finger joints, I should say, that may be inflamed, and including the eyes, right? So including the eyes and including the kidneys, for those disorders that we've mentioned already, from a rheumatoid and inflammatory standpoint. It'll go to the vessels in the eyes as well as the kidneys.
So it sounds to me,
come from? What? How do I get it? Or is it something that just happens all by itself?
And we got a little static there. How do you get? I guess I'm missing the question, or I don't know.
No, I said, how do you? I'm asking, where does this information come from? What starts it? What's the etiology, if we want to use a doctory word? But what's the cause of this inflammation? Where did I? It hurt myself? Did I take something that did it? What caused it?
I don't know if anyone wants to answer, but Dr. Pete sort of explained it already. When he said that it's like if you bang your toe, everyone understands, you can see that. But when there's damage that occurs internally, just because you can't see it, the same inflammatory response occurs. So with multiple disease states, you can see the toe, you can feel it. But when you damage we've got some noise going, but that same response that Pete mentioned is occurring, or I shouldn't say exactly the same, but very similar response is occurring within the body with damage that has occurred that you just can't obviously see, right? So that's why I thought that was a great example, because these are things that everyone can tangibly and visibly picture. But those same things occur when you have a given disease state. When you have a heart attack, that's what kicks in. Even though the heart attack was led up to by that inflammation, believe it or not, once you have it, then you have more of an inflammatory response.
So one of the things that I talk about, and one of the things that I'm noticing is there's certain things that we call them triggers that can trigger or lead to an inflammatory response. Dr. Pittman, you being the expert in diabetes, you can, what are your thoughts about low glycemic index foods, high glycemic index foods, and how those can trigger? I almost think, third example of almost the same thing. If I have a cup full of vinegar and I drop baking soda in it, it starts that inflammatory reaction, right? And I use a cup full of vinegar because you got something that's stable. It's, at a base, and then you put something in it. Now, for me and my experience, if I'm walking around, with my blood glucose level, and I'm just walking around, I'm at a baseline, and I take, instead of baking soda, I take sugar. Let's just take sugar. And those crystals aren't baking soda anymore. They're sugar, like the white crystallized the sugar, and I drop it in there. That starts an inflammatory response, not just where my pancreas is or where my kidneys are or where my eyeballs are, in my entire body, because wherever that baking soda or sugar gets, it triggers that inflammatory response. For instance, if I take that cup and spill a little on the table, the inflammatory response will be on the table. Much like, have you ever seen when we were younger, we would eat those popsicles in the summer and we would get that sugar all over. You can feel it rolling through your veins, and then you start running around and things like that. Everywhere that sugar is in your bloodstream, that's where the inflammatory response is. And so I like to think of the triggers when I explain it. I say there, that's not the end of the story. Here's what you can do about it. Look at things that won't trigger it. Look at things that will definitely trigger it. And then you adjust your intake and nutrition in a maintenance form, thinking of things I'm taking in as medicine that can hurt me, they can harm me, they can help me also. So I think we were, and then where does fish oil fall in the inflammatory process, Dr. Pittman? So is sugar a trigger? Is sugar hitting my toe on the bed, like Dr. P said, instead of hitting my toe, I decided I was going to eat some sugar? Is that the trigger?
And I don't know if anyone wants to chime in or not before I get started, but from the standpoint of glucose or sugar, flat out, that depends, right? And I gave the example of children right up front. If you have what is called normal glucose tolerance, normal sugar tolerance, or normal carbohydrate metabolism, then it's not really an issue, right? But go ahead.
Does that mean if I have a normal glucose tolerance, so I said sugar, but we can think of potatoes, rice, things that,
anything
so
that
does that mean
glucose or
sorry.
starch. Yeah.
So does that mean if I have a normal response, I don't have the same inflammatory response as someone who has an abnormal response?
Oh, absolutely. So now what we mean by normal, just to clarify, what we mean by normal does not necessarily mean that your blood sugar that you measure with your finger stick or something like that stays normal. What we mean by normal is truly on a cellular level and on a molecular level, all of the processes are on a chemical reaction level, as was stated by Dr. Graham, everything is occurring normally. Right, then you're handling the process. But as we know, just from a genetic standpoint, one of the beauties for me of endocrinology is that every single person is different. One person's metabolism is not the same as another person's metabolism, and that's the beauty of it. But it's also the complexity of it, right? And the same thing, we know that from a genetic standpoint, we're different. We know each person. We know that from an aging standpoint, that has a different variance. But and from a corresponding or other disease states that are coexisting, it's a difference. Things like high blood pressure and high cholesterol being in the mix, there is a difference. We know that all of these things make a difference in terms of how diseases progress. But one of the big ones that Dr. Harrington keeps alluding to is what we call in medicine adiposity, but what our patients simply call being overweight or fat, right? Fat cells. We know that as you build up these fat cells or adipocytes, inflammation increases. Right? Those cells were not meant to be stuffed with all the stuff we put in them. And they respond molecularly to being overstuffed, much the same as we respond to being overstuffed. So if you look at it and say, well, hey, if I overeat, I don't care if you're, a thin, long distance runner. It doesn't matter. If you overeat at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, you feel it, right? You feel it, and it doesn't feel so good. When people stuff those cells, those individual cells, with extra stuff, extra fat, extra molecules that aren't supposed to be there, and they have to stretch, that actually causes a response that goes throughout the entire body, right? That responds to and that's why when you give the example of the glucose, it's not always just the glucose. The reality is that the fact that every cell in our body uses glucose. Fat is simply a storage form for energy, and protein is what we use to make different molecules. But our energy source is glucose.
I just want
When
to.
we don't have enough, or when we have too much, it goes to fat, and that makes those cells do work that they didn't want to do. And that sets off a bunch of stuff that goes throughout the whole body. And that's to your sprinkling glucose. Sometimes it's not the glucose. It's where what has to happen to the glucose to get rid of it that becomes the problem.
We're running up out of time, and I want to ask this question because we got to give people something they can do. So
we're okay on time, Dr. Mason.
Well,
we're okay.
but I know it's going to take us time to get through this a little bit.
But we're okay on time. The congressman is actually signing in right now, so we're good.
Okay, so the question I want to put out is, what is the role of the things that we eat to this inflammatory process?
I'm going to start by saying, given that this appears to be, largely endocrine based, I'm going to start by saying we're doing the first and best thing we can do, and that's awareness. Because I'm not going to go all biblical on you, but I'm going to say, for the lack of knowledge, we shall perish, or they shall perish, right? That's first and foremost, right? So awareness is a key, and I've already said, awareness. The desire for awareness is the reason that I formed my own diabetes centers, and we keep expanding from state to state, is awareness. Now, recognizing that where do we go from there? You're absolutely right. As Dr. Harrington has mentioned, recognizing that exercise is critical. Lean body mass is critical. Not stuffing those cells, right? Because we can say, oh, well, don't eat fatty foods. But what a lot of people have to realize is that you don't have to eat fatty foods. Overeating in general, no matter what it is you eat, your body only can deal with so many nutrients at a time, and then everything else gets converted to fat. So it doesn't have to be fat, right? People will sometimes think, oh, well, I only eat smoothies, and it's zero fat. Well, all of that glucose gets converted to fat because you don't need all of that sugar to function, and people think, oh, I'm a vegetarian, I don't have to worry. No, it depends. It depends on what you consume, and how much of what you consume for your given metabolism, not your neighbor's metabolism and not your best friend's metabolism. Your metabolism, how your body gets rid of these nutrients is critical to whether you're stuffing those cells with unneeded nutrients that will then set off a cascade of events that will not be favorable to you. But yeah, absolutely, these open discussions are critical.
There are many things that, we look at, and in our society, we have a lot of things that are processed. Are these things more likely than not to, and I don't know where your data may be from, but are these things more likely than not to be more likely to be inflammatory or not?
Of course, right? They're molecules that aren't supposed to be there. I tell my patients all the time when I ask them how much water they drink, and they say, oh, well, I don't drink much water, but I drink tea, or I drink coffee, or I drink, diet soda. There's no sugar. And I remind them, well, first of all, the human body was not designed to consume diet soda. And it was not designed to drink Crystal Light. And so all of those other molecules that have nothing to do with how the body normally works have to be processed, and it puts all of your cells to work. And sometimes it puts those cells to work in a way that can be damaging because the cells don't know what to do with them. They're not meant to be there, right? For the past, 30,000 years of evolution, it had nothing to do with those molecules. And so now they have to figure out what to do with them. And so there can be badness. And so even if they did know what to do with them, now you're talking about processed food, which we know there's newer things that have come up within the past 10 years that didn't exist. And now that we've got the congressman on the line, we could say that, you know, let's face it, a lot of our patients are afraid of certain medicines. And as you know, as a chemist, I let them know all the time, when I give you a medicine, you know exactly what's in it and what's on, and you know what it can do is on the package insert, and you can ask me, and every molecule that's there has to be listed. The FDA has made sure that it's, you know, a certain percentage. When you bite into that hamburger, you actually don't know the molecules that are there outside of beef, right? And I'm a chemist. I can tell you there's a lot of stuff there that you don't know about in your body. So that's what you mean by the processed food, I'm sure. When you bite into a McNugget, or maybe I shouldn't say McNugget because that probably brands it, I don't know. But when you bite into a piece of, you know, processed food, then you don't know what chemicals are there. There's no regulation to say that someone has to list every single molecule that is actually being used to generate that. And your body will respond to every single one of them, not some of them. Every single one of them will generate a response. That is not the pure protein that would come from a chicken or the pure water that would be there. And so everything else is going to generate a response. And that response may be, not saying it will be, but may be inflammatory, all the way down to the coloring, the oil, everything. All of those things that would not naturally be consumed, all of them may cause a negative inflammatory response. And this is the concern that the population has with processed food.
So, you know, one of our viewers has a great question. Janice Henry asks, can you remove fat cells? You know, let me run back to her question really quickly. She said, so how do you get rid of fat cells? Is that possible to do?
Now we got a plastic surgeon question. Anyone else? Because I was, you know, plastic surgery, but, you know, that literally, I mean, so when people have lipo, that's what they're doing. They're removing fat cells. So that is a way to remove fat cells. When you lose weight, you're not removing fat cells. You still have the same number of fat cells. They're just not distended or stretched to the same degree, but you still have those cells. But, you know, when you talk about removing them, you know, you're now talking about removing cells from your body, which, by the way, comes with its own set of inflammatory responses from that standpoint. So not saying that that's, you know, an absolute route to go.
So the only way to remove a fat cell is surgically. Even if you lose weight, you still have fat cells, right?
Oh yeah, when you lose weight, you have them. Now they could be removed by what we call necrosis, or meaning the cells die. Meaning if they don't get a blood supply, then they'll die. That's not necessarily good either, because that's even more inflammation. We have disorders of losing cells. There's lots of different things that can happen, but let's just say they're not typically a favorable thing that would occur when you know, so the most favorable would be to maintain your normal body structure, your normal cell count, but allowing those cells to function normally, meaning they remain a normal size with normal blood flow and normal circulation and things like that.
There was also a
add
question
to
from
that. I would also add to that.
From one of our viewers that says,
"Oh, I'm sorry, Nikki."
Oh no, it's okay. One of our viewers also asked the question: will stress cause inflammation?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
What I was going to say, Nikki, is that
yes, sir.
What we need to also understand, the audience needs to also understand, is that when we're eating certain things, as the doctor just mentioned, Some of them are more inflammatory than others.
Mhm.
And some, not just solid foods, but liquid foods can be inflammatory as well. And in terms of reducing the calories or reducing what feeds and makes the fat cells bigger, that's also a function of some of the stuff that we eat. So we need to just be really careful. And we're not doing a very good job of eliminating some of the bad things that we eat, because if we did, we wouldn't be spending tens of millions of dollars on medications for constipation. So we really need to do a better job thinking about these things from the time that when we begin to eat, and understand that there are foods that have less fat propensity and things that you can eat that would not generate as much fat, and the other things you can eat that would generate a lot more fat. Some of those are fat themselves, and some of them may be other things. But I think that, to the point, we do need to make an honest effort to know that we've got to eat better if we want to live better.
Well, it is getting close to our time. We're going to take these last two questions, and then we're going to move right over to the congressman. Nellie Purnell King asked the question, can neuropathy be cured?
I'm presuming they mean diabetic neuropathy, because there's several disorders that can cause neuropathy or damage to nerves, and that's from a diabetic standpoint or diabetes standpoint. That depends on the extent. It definitely can be improved. Cured, again, we had that discussion last time, meaning it's completely gone. And so, when we use the word cure, we have to be careful in medicine. And so, can you improve neuropathy, in particular diabetic neuropathy? Absolutely. Can we treat diabetic neuropathy? Absolutely. Cure is a state of where we are in the process of neuropathy. Sometimes, people will present with significant diabetic neuropathy when they're first diagnosed, and it completely goes away because, as we mentioned already, the sugar itself can irritate the nerves. And not just the sugar, the fact that when you're diabetic, you abnormally metabolize your fats. And so you build up these molecules, as we've all been discussing, inflammatory molecules. One of them is something called fatty acids, or fats, that get processed improperly. And those free, as we call them, fatty acids, when they're just not linked to anything, they are inflammatory molecules. And that process improves too when you start to treat diabetes. So that, yes, a lot of that can mess with nerves and send weird signals so that people feel weird things, numbness, tingling, burning. But a lot of that can go back to normal once it's treated. And so it really depends on where they are.
Outstanding. And Lolita Travis asked, and this is our final question for this evening. I know we have so many questions and we try to get to everybody, and we'll bring those questions back to you next week. We try not to leave any questions on the table, as you guys know. But Lolita Travis asked, what about freezing fat cells? Is that possible? There are some new studies out here about freezing fat cells away. Does that work?
Anyone else want to chime in on that one? But
I just say that I know people who tried it. They've not been happy long term with it. And I think the issue is they might go to sleep temporarily, but unless they're removed surgically, they're still there.
All right. I thank you guys so very much. And our team over at the Core Center, we know you're here and they are working, but they just wanted the congressman to know that they are here and they are watching as always. To Miss Berry, who actually made the statement a couple of weeks ago about being cured, she actually came back this week and she stated that her husband, I had brought up an issue about asthma, and I know Dr. Pittman and I had kind of talked about that for a second when we were here, when we were talking about the word cure. And she had shared that her husband was cured of asthma and that I could have been cured and that you can be cured from diabetes. And I understand exactly what you're saying, but here's what I would like to share with you. When I was in high school, my asthma really improved a lot. And I had no symptoms for about 7 years. So through high school and the beginning of college, I had no symptoms. I think I probably turned about 21 and I had a severe asthma attack and ended back in the hospital. And since then, my asthma it's under control, but it has its moments. So this is why I made the statement that I am not cured, that my asthma is controlled, that it improves, but it still has the opportunity to flare up every now and then. And I know that that's what Dr. Pittman was meaning when he talked about the diabetes. You can improve it, you can stay on top of it, you can control it, but we cannot think that we don't have it. Just like I stay away from certain chemicals that will trigger my asthma, I stay away from certain foods that trigger my asthma, because I know if I eat a Hershey bar, I get to wheezing later. So I try not to eat Hershey bars so it won't trigger my asthma. Same thing with the diabetic. If you know that eating a Hershey bar will inflate those levels, then you should maybe not eat the Hershey bar. So you have to control it. They work hand in hand. So we're not saying that. What we're saying is that you can control things and you can improve things. And we want to make sure that we keep that awareness on the table. Once again, we're going to share that this program is for informational purposes only. We would not advise anyone to stop taking medication because you are feeling better. Sometimes that's what's keeping you in the control levels. And if you work at it, you can do very good with it. So we want to thank you guys for being here and always watching as you do. Remember to send your comments and send your topics that you want to hear us share and discuss. And as we go around the table once again to do our Until Next Mondays, Dr. Maya had to go. She was actually on call and had to see some patients, but she wanted to remind everyone to make sure you get your new COVID shot that's coming up because numbers are going up. So she wanted to that's her Until Next Monday. Dr. Mason, what's your Until Next Monday?
Until next Monday, I want you to think about the things that you've heard today. And the question is, what of it can you integrate into your life to make your life better for yourself? We can't medicalize ourselves out of this. That's not the answer. We have to take responsibility for trying to prevent the things that cause it in the first place. That's my Until Next Monday.
Outstanding. Sunny says, thank you, doctors. Thought provoking as always. Much respect to the panel. Laura Leon wants to thank the congressman for the valuable information that is shared each week. And she says, Dr. Pittman mentioned awareness, and that's exactly what it is, awareness. Joe Harrington, you're Until Next Monday.
Well, I was reminded that my esteemed colleagues, all of them are doctors of medicine, and they are trained in the art and science of medicine. And tonight's discussion was around that art of medicine. That's what we've been talking about, how we understand and we apply what we learn. And so I want to applaud them for the answers that they gave today. I also want to make a statement that actually, when I worked at the health department in the 1980s and my focus was hypertension, we had a tagline: "What you don't know can kill you." And I hope the information we provided today will help people make a change in their lives moving forward. There are things that you can do when you have a disease, when you have a problem, but it's really about getting the knowledge you need so you can have a healthy and long life.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. Donna Marie says, I still don't understand what inflammation is. And Donna, we're going to bring that question back up because we have some doctors. You know, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and it's also Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we have some doctors that want to talk about inflammation and breast cancer. So we'll be sharing that with you on next week. We're not going to forget about you. I saw your question, and I just wanted to let you know that I saw it there. And then you also want to thank us for a good program. And Donna Marie, we thank you for listening and watching as you do. Doug, you're Until Next Monday.
Leo, Nikki, I'm back to the Chicago area. I just want to build on what Dr. Pittman and what Dr. Mason said. I went to the supermarkets, but this past weekend, I went to a farmer's market. And let me tell you, the produce, the fresh fruits and vegetables you get there are really amazing. And so if you have the time and you can get to them, definitely recommend them because if you eat better, you'll feel better.
Outstanding, outstanding. Thank you so much. I want to say hey to the crew over at DLV Printing here on the west side of Chicago, who is also listening and watching as well. They are working away, but they are listening. So they have some great comments, and know that we appreciate all the great work that you do as well. Nellie Parnell is here, and she says, valuable information as always. And she thanks the congressman. Dr. Miller, you're until next Monday.
I hope that people have been listening intensely and that they've learned some valuable lessons from tonight. Until next Monday, I want to just say that remember, there are things that you can do. And remember that the things that you consume are going to affect you one way or the other. And try to consume the things that are going to affect you in a positive way, not those things that are going to harm you. Learn what harm you. It's important for you to know that, because if you don't know, there's no way for you to be able to make the correct choices. So learning what is good for you and then following that and consuming that is so valuable. So that's my until next Monday.
Outstanding, outstanding. Thank you so much, Dr. Pittman. You're until next Monday.
All right. Again, thank you guys for having me on the show again. And I will simply close out with saying that, of course, diabetes is of epidemic proportion, but there are things that we can do actively. And one of them is not just cutting back on what we consume, but exercise is critical. It is absolute. So this is why so many different diets don't work long term, is because they are done in absence of thinking about exercise, right? So it's how much muscle mass compared to fat that matters, not just how little fat. What is the muscle mass compared to the fat that makes a difference? And of course, hydrating. And by hydrating, I mean water, right? We need people actually drinking water, not tea and soda. And I'm not going to come down on any given product, but we need folks drinking at least 2 to 3 liters a day. And that's just basic. They because every molecular process in your body requires water. We ourselves are 70% water. We're not 70% soda. So we or pop. We need or coffee, right? We need water, and we have to build muscle mass. And so I'll close there with saying that's how you address the epidemic, especially for the youth. That because we have to consider them. We have to consider the youth and put those habits in them.
Outstanding. Just want to remind everyone to join us for our next town hall meeting, our part 2 that you requested on Departing with Dignity. That will be Thursday, October 5th, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. at the Callahan Legacy Center. That's 7030 South Halsted in Chicago. Once again, it's the Callahan Legacy Center, 7030 South Halsted, Thursday, October 5th. At that time, we will be learning about palliative care, hospice care, tragic departures from violence, terminal illnesses, readiness preparation, advanced planning, insurance and funding and assistance, victims compensation, legal assistance, trust, probate, estate awareness, powers of attorneys, bereavement therapy and resources, and so much more. So join us Thursday, October 5th from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. at the Callahan Legacy Center. That's 7030 South Halsted. That information will be placed in the comments just so you can make sure you have it, share it with everyone. Well, Congressman, give us your updates and take us home. Oh, we turn.
Sir, you on mute.
1 second. Give us 1 second. Let's see if we can fix the tech difficulties we're having with his sound. Okay, yeah, it's not a mute, it's a connection issue. So give us 1 second. We're working on this connection issue. And while we are reconnecting him, Dr. Pittman, do you have any announcements of any great things you have coming up? I know you were putting together this informational or this musical something that you were doing. I don't want to call it
Yeah.
a concert or something, but you were putting together
Well,
this.
it is actually a concert series.
Okay. The music therapy concert about diabetes. So I know you were, where are we?
Again, just diabetes awareness. And
Okay.
A buddy of mine, Mark Calderon, former vocalist, and actually, no, I should say former, because he actually is now the brand, but he's always a member of Color Me Bad. Is actually going to be emceeing an event that we're going to have right here in Terre Haute, and be helping me out with other, entertainers for coming on board for diabetes awareness, and yeah, we're calling it rock and roll over diabetes. As you know, we come out and raise diabetes awareness, and have a good time at the same time. It removes some of the negative stigma associated with the disorder as we increase awareness, increase knowledge. And so, yeah, folks, be on the lookout for it. You should be hearing about it. We're expanding in Chicago. We have 3 new locations that will be opening in the Chicago area as well. So, you guys should be hearing about us, not only at Loretto Hospital, but Weiss Hospital in Oak Park, at West Suburban and River Forest as well. So you should be seeing HPW, Center for Diabetes, and hear about us as we move into 2024 around the Chicago area.
Okay, so Congressman, say something so we can see if we can hear you now. All right, so we can't hear you, but what I am going to do, because I believe you can hear us, because I know you've been nodding and you've been really interactive, I'm going to call you, and you can simply talk through your phone, so we'll be able to hear you. It may be a little...
What about now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I missed a great deal of the conversation, but I tell you, over the weekend, I had such a great time. We had about 10,000 African Americans, 10,000 Black people in Washington, D.C. as one of the most informative, most delightful, most enlightening, and most inspirational gatherings I've seen there in a long time.
Nikki, somebody needs to mute the phone.
Actually, it's hers. As a sound guy, Nikki, if you don't mind putting your phone behind your monitor,
Okay.
where the microphone is. So if you put it behind it, so the sound is not going directly in, that should kill some of the feedback.
Okay, keep talking, Congressman.
Well, we'll just tolerate this. Let me thank you all for another stimulating discussion. I've been in Birmingham, Illinois all evening, having a wonderful time.
So, Congressman, mute your computer. If you mute your computer, I think the feedback will go away.
All right. Does that do it?
Yes.
Better.
All right. Well, I think we're just having a great time. The only thing I really have to say is thanks for another great discussion. Health is wealth, and we have to keep it going until next Monday. I hope that we're still open. That is, I hope the government is still open. Because if we don't reach some agreement in the next week or two, we will be shut down, because some of my colleagues want to do that. So have a good evening, a wonderful discussion, and until next Monday,